Little Italy, New York, October 1995. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of Carbone's restaurant like 1,000 angry fingers demanding entry. Inside, beneath the amber glow of vintage Edison bulbs and walls adorned with black and white photographs of old New York, 10-year-old Marco Vitale sat across from his father, picking at a plate of rigatoni he no longer had an appetite for. "You're not eating, figlio mio," Salvatore Vitale observed, his deep voice carrying the weight of authority that made grown men tremble. But when he looked at his son, his dark eyes softened with a warmth reserved only for family. "Your mama's gonna think I took you to a bad restaurant." Marco forced a smile, twirling his fork nervously. "Papa, why do those men outside always follow us?" Salvatore's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Through the rain-streaked window, the silhouettes of 3 black sedans were visible, parked across the narrow cobblestone street. He reached across the table, his calloused hand enveloping his son's small one. "Because your papa has responsibilities, Marco, important ones. But you don't worry about that tonight, okay? Tonight is just for us." The restaurant owner, an elderly man named Giuseppe who had known Salvatore since they were boys in Sicily, approached the table with a nervous smile. His hands trembled slightly as he refilled Salvatore's wineglass. "Don Vitale, forgive the interruption, but there are gentlemen asking to speak with you outside." Salvatore's expression remained unchanged, but Marco felt his father's hand tense around his own. "Tell them I'm having dinner with my son. They insisted it was urgent." "Giuseppe." The single word carried enough weight to make the old man step back. "I said I'm having dinner with my son." Giuseppe nodded quickly and retreated to the kitchen. Marco watched his father's face, seeing something there he didn't fully understand, a mixture of weariness and resignation that seemed far too heavy for one man to carry. "Papa, are you in trouble?" Salvatore's laugh was hollow. "Trouble and I are old friends, Marco, but listen to me carefully." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "If anything ever happens to me, and I mean anything, you find Uncle Tommy. You understand? Tommy Marconi. He'll know what to do." "Papa, you're scaring me." The front door exploded inward. The crash of splintering wood merged with the sudden cacophony of shouting voices. 4 men burst through the entrance, their faces concealed by black ski masks, their hands gripping weapons that looked impossibly large to Marco's young eyes. Everything happened in fragments, like a movie reel running too fast. Salvatore lunged across the table, grabbing Marco and pulling him down just as the first shots rang out. The deafening cracks echoed off the restaurant's brick walls, mixing with the screams of the few other patrons. Giuseppe collapsed behind the bar, a red stain spreading across his white shirt. "Stay down," Salvatore commanded, shoving Marco under the table. Marco pressed his hands over his ears, his heart hammering so violently he thought it might burst through his chest. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the aroma of tomato sauce, creating a nauseating cocktail that burned his throat. Salvatore's bodyguards, 2 men who had been seated near the entrance, returned fire. The restaurant transformed into a war zone, wineglasses shattered, raining crystal across white tablecloths. Bullets punched holes through the vintage photographs on the walls, through memories of old New York, through the illusion of safety. Marco peeked out from under the table, his child's mind unable to process the horror unfolding before him. He saw one of the masked men go down, clutching his chest. Saw his father produce a gun from inside his jacket with practiced ease, firing with cold precision, but there were too many of them. One of the attackers flanked left, coming around the bar. Marco saw him before his father did, saw the gun rise, saw the finger squeeze the trigger. "Papa!" Salvatore turned at his son's scream, but it was already too late. The bullet caught him in the chest, spinning him around. Then another, and another. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Marco watched his father, the man who had seemed invincible, untouchable, stumble backward, his white shirt blooming red. Salvatore's eyes found his son's, and in that moment, Marco saw something he would never forget. Not fear, but profound sadness. "Run," Salvatore mouthed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, but Marco couldn't move. His legs had turned to stone. He watched as his father collapsed to his knees, then forward onto the black and white checkered floor. The tile beneath him slowly turned crimson, spreading outward like a horrible flower opening its petals. "Check the back," one of the masked men shouted. "Make sure there's no one else." "What about the kid?" The leader, a tall man with pale blue eyes visible through his mask, looked directly at Marco. The boy stared back, tears streaming down his face, his small hands clenched into fists. "Leave him," the leader said coldly. "He's just a child." "What's he going to do?" The masked men fled as quickly as they had come, disappearing into the rainy October night. In the sudden silence, Marco could hear the patter of rain, the distant wail of sirens, and his own ragged breathing. He crawled out from under the table on trembling hands and knees. The floor was slick with blood and broken glass. He didn't feel the cuts opening on his palms. "Papa?" His voice was small, childlike, lost. Salvatore Vitale lay motionless, his eyes open but unseeing, staring at the ceiling. Marco reached him and pressed his small hands against his father's chest, trying desperately to stop the bleeding, but there was too much. It soaked through his fingers, warm and sticky. "Papa, please wake up, please. I'm sorry, I didn't eat my dinner. I'll eat it all now, I promise. Just wake up. Please." But Salvatore Vitale, the most feared Mafia boss in New York, the man who had controlled half of Little Italy with an iron fist wrapped in velvet, would never wake up again. The sirens grew louder. Marco sat there in his father's blood, rocking back and forth, his young mind fracturing under the weight of what he had witnessed. Around him, the rain continued to fall, washing away nothing, cleaning nothing, changing nothing. 2 hours later, the scene outside Carbone's restaurant looked like something from a crime drama. Police cruisers blocked off the entire street, their red and blue lights painting the wet cobblestones in alternating colors. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the wind. Detectives moved in and out of the building, their faces grim. Marco sat in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a thermal blanket that did nothing to stop his shivering. A female EMT with kind eyes had cleaned the cuts on his hands and checked him for injuries, speaking softly the entire time, but he hadn't heard a word. He stared straight ahead, seeing nothing, his mind replaying the same scene over and over. His father falling, the blood, those cold blue eyes looking at him through the mask. "Marco?" The boy didn't respond. A detective, a middle-aged Italian man with graying hair and sad eyes, crouched down in front of him. His badge read Detective Angelo Russo. "Marco, my name is Angelo. I'm going to help you, okay? Can you tell me what happened?" Silence. "Did you see the men who did this? Can you describe them?" More silence. Detective Russo sighed and exchanged a glance with his partner, a younger black woman named Detective Harris. They both knew the signs. The kid was in shock, maybe traumatized beyond immediate reach. They'd seen it before, witnesses, especially children, who retreated so far into themselves after witnessing violence that they couldn't speak for days, sometimes weeks. "Is there someone we can call?" Detective Harris asked gently. "Family? Your mother?" At the mention of his mother, something flickered across Marco's face, a fresh wave of pain. His mother had died 2 years ago from cancer. It had been just him and his father since then. "Uncle Tommy," Marco whispered, so quietly they almost missed it. "Uncle Tommy?" Detective Russo leaned closer. "Does he have a last name, son?" "Marconi. Tommy Marconi. Papa said if anything happened..." His voice broke, and the tears came again, harder this time. Detective Russo gently squeezed the boy's shoulder. "Okay, Marco. We'll find Uncle Tommy. You're going to be okay." But even as he said the words, Detective Russo knew they were a lie. This kid would never be okay again. He'd seen his father murdered right in front of him. That kind of trauma didn't heal. It festered, grew, transformed into something else entirely, something darker. Across the city, in a smoke-filled social club in Brooklyn, Tommy Marconi received the phone call that would change everything. He was in his mid-30s, a lean man with sharp features and sharper eyes, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit. When his phone rang, the private line that only a handful of people had access to, he excused himself from the card game and stepped into a back room. "Yeah? Mr. Marconi? This is Detective Angelo Russo with NYPD Homicide. I'm calling about Salvatore Vitale." Tommy's blood ran cold. "What about Sal?" "I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Vitale was killed tonight in what appears to be a targeted hit. There was a child with him, his son, Marco. The boy said you're his uncle. He's asking for you." The phone nearly slipped from Tommy's hand. Salvatore was dead. His best friend, his brother in everything but blood, gunned down. And little Marco. "Where is he?" Tommy's voice was tight, controlled, dangerous. "St. Vincent's Hospital. He's not injured physically, but he's in shock. Mr. Marconi, when you come, you should know. The boy witnessed everything. He saw his father die. Tommy closed his eyes, his free hand clenching into a fist. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up and stood there for a moment, his mind racing. Salvatore had been the glue holding the 5 families together, the one man everyone respected enough to maintain the peace. With him gone, the city would erupt into war. Blood would flow through the streets of New York like rivers. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, a 10-year-old boy needed him. Tommy grabbed his coat and headed for the door, calling back to his men. "Salvatore's dead. Lock down everything. Trust no one. I'll be back." The drive to St. Vincent's Hospital felt like it took hours, though it was barely 20 minutes. Tommy's mind kept returning to the last conversation he'd had with Salvatore just 3 days ago. "Tommy, if something happens to me, you watch over Marco. You hear me? He's all I got in this world. You make sure nothing touches that boy. Nothing's gonna happen to you, Sal. You're untouchable." "Nobody's untouchable, Tommy. Not in this life. Just promise me." "I promise, brother. I promise." Tommy found Marco in a private room on the 3rd floor, still wrapped in that thermal blanket, staring at the wall. Detective Russo was sitting beside him, trying to maintain a professional distance while clearly concerned for the traumatized child. "Uncle Tommy..." The moment Marco saw him, the dam broke. The boy flew from the hospital bed and wrapped his arms around Tommy's waist, sobbing into his suit jacket with a desperation that shattered Tommy's heart into pieces. Hey, it's okay, kiddo. I got you. Uncle Tommy's here." He held the boy tight, feeling the violent shaking of his small body. "I got you, Marco. I got you." Detective Russo stepped back, giving them space. Tommy looked at him over Marco's head, and the detective saw something in the gangster's eyes that made him uneasy. A cold, calculating fury barely held in check. "Can I take him home?" Tommy asked. "We'll need to ask him some questions eventually when he's ready, and there's the matter of custody. He's my nephew. I'm his legal guardian now." It wasn't a question or a request. Detective Russo hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'll need to verify that, but yes, I think that can be arranged. Mr. Marconi, if the boy saw anything, if he can identify..." "He's 10 years old, Detective. He just watched his father get murdered. You really think he's in any condition to help you right now?" The two men stared at each other, the tension thick between them. Finally, Detective Russo backed down. "We'll be in touch. Take care of him, Mr. Marconi." "I will." Tommy took Marco back to his townhouse in Brooklyn, a modest but secure place that served as both his home and occasional safe house. The boy hadn't spoken since leaving the hospital, just stared out the window of Tommy's car as the rain-soaked streets of New York passed by. Inside, Tommy settled Marco into the guest bedroom. He helped the boy out of his blood-stained clothes. Marco flinched when Tommy touched the shirt, as if the fabric itself carried the memory of violence, and into clean pajamas. "You hungry, kid? Want me to make you something?" Marco shook his head. "You need to try to sleep, okay? I know it's hard, but..." They looked at me. Marco's voice was hollow, distant. "One of them. He looked right at me and said, 'What's he gonna do?' He's just a child." Tommy sat down on the edge of the bed, his jaw tight. "Marco, listen to me carefully. What happened tonight? They killed my papa." The boy's eyes finally found Tommy's, and they were full of a pain no child should ever have to carry. "They killed him and they walked away. They just walked away." "I know, kiddo, I know. And I'm going to find them. I promise you that." "And then what?" There was something in Marco's voice now, something that made Tommy's blood run cold. Not fear, not sadness, anger. Cold, focused, terrifying anger in a 10-year-old's eyes. "Then they'll pay for what they did," Tommy said quietly. "But that's not for you to worry about. You're a kid. You should be thinking about school and friends and..." I saw his face, the leader, his eyes. Marco's small hands clenched the blanket. "I'll never forget them." "Never?" Tommy didn't know what to say. He wanted to tell Marco to forget, to move on, to have a normal life. But looking into the boy's eyes, he knew that option had died tonight on that restaurant floor. Salvatore had been trying to keep Marco away from the life, to give him a chance at something better. But fate had other plans. "Get some rest," Tommy finally said, standing up. "I'll be right downstairs if you need anything." But as he reached the door, Marco's voice stopped him. "Uncle Tommy, can you teach me?" "Teach you what, kiddo?" Marco looked up at him, and in that moment Tommy didn't see a 10-year-old child. He saw someone much older, someone who had already crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. Teach me to be like Papa. Teach me to be strong, so that nobody can ever hurt me again. Tommy closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Salvatore's last request crushing down on him. Watch over Marco. Make sure nothing touches that boy. But how could he protect Marco from the darkness when the darkness was already inside him? We'll talk about it tomorrow, Tommy said softly. Sleep now. He closed the door and leaned against it, running his hands through his hair. Downstairs, his phone was already buzzing with calls from the other families, from associates, from enemies sensing blood in the water. Salvatore Vitale was dead. The king was gone. And New York City was about to tear itself apart. But Tommy barely heard the chaos. All he could think about was the look in Marco's eyes, the cold determination, the quiet rage. They thought the war ended tonight, Tommy thought grimly. They have no idea what they've started. Outside, the October rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the darkness, 4 men celebrated their successful hit, convinced they had eliminated the threat. They were wrong. They hadn't killed the threat. They had created it. 1 year later, October 1996, the basement of Tommy Marconi's Brooklyn townhouse had been converted into something between a gym and a training ground. Concrete walls, heavy bags hanging from reinforced beams, weapons locked in a steel cabinet that Marco wasn't supposed to know about but did. 11-year-old Marco Vitale stood in the center of the space, his thin arms raised in a defensive stance, sweat already soaking through his gray t-shirt despite the morning chill. Across from him, Tommy circled slowly, his movements fluid and controlled. "Remember what I told you," Tommy said, his voice calm but firm. "Fighting isn't about being the strongest. It's about being smarter, faster, more willing to do what needs to be done." Marco nodded, his dark eyes tracking Tommy's every movement. In the year since his father's death, the boy had changed in ways that unsettled even Tommy. He no longer cried. He no longer spoke about that night unless Tommy brought it up. Instead, he had channeled all his grief, all his rage, into a single-minded determination that was almost frightening in its intensity. Every morning before school, training. Every evening after homework, training. Weekends, more training. Tommy had tried to slow him down, to remind him he was just a kid, but Marco wouldn't hear it. And deep down, Tommy understood. The boy was trying to fill the hollow space his father's death had left behind, trying to transform his pain into power. "Come at me," Tommy instructed. "Show me what you've learned." Marco lunged forward, faster than most kids his age could move, throwing a combination of punches that Tommy deflected easily. But the boy didn't stop. He pivoted, went low, tried to sweep Tommy's legs, a move they'd practiced just last week. Tommy sidestepped, but he was impressed. The kid was a natural absorbing techniques like a sponge. It made sense. Salvatore had been the same way. "Better," Tommy acknowledged. "But you're telegraphing your moves. Your shoulders tense before you strike. In a real fight, that hesitation gets you killed." "Again," Marco demanded, breathing hard. They went 5 more rounds before Tommy finally called a halt. Marco's knuckles were raw, his face flushed with exertion, but his eyes burned with an intensity that never seemed to dim. "Enough for today," Tommy said, tossing Marco a towel. "You got school in an hour. 5 more minutes. Marco, please." Tommy sighed, recognizing the plea for what it really was. Every minute spent training was a minute Marco didn't have to think about the nightmares that still woke him up screaming. Every punch thrown was one less memory of his father's blood spreading across that checkered floor. "Fine, 5 minutes, then you hit the shower, or Sister Margaret's gonna have my head for sending you in smelling like a gym." Marco actually cracked a small smile at that. Sister Margaret ran St. Anthony's Catholic school with an iron fist, and a ruler she wasn't afraid to use. She was also one of the few people who seemed able to reach past Marco's walls, treating him not like a traumatized orphan, but like any other student who needed discipline and guidance. As Marco pummeled the heavy bag with renewed vigor, Tommy leaned against the wall and watched, wondering, not for the first time, if he was doing the right thing. Salvatore had wanted Marco away from the life, had dreamed of his son becoming a lawyer, or a doctor, or anything legitimate. But how could Tommy honor that wish now? The boy had witnessed his father's murder. That kind of trauma didn't just disappear, it had to go somewhere. So Tommy was giving it direction, teaching him to channel it, control it, weaponize it. "Forgive me, Sal," Tommy thought, but I don't know what else to do. Summer 1999, Catskill Mountains, upstate New York. At 14, Marco was no longer the skinny kid who had cowered under a restaurant table. He had grown taller, his frame filling out with lean muscle earned through relentless training. His face had lost its childish softness, replaced by sharp angles that echoed his father's features. Tommy had brought him to a secluded cabin in the Catskills for what he called advanced education. In reality, it was the next phase of Marco's transformation. "This is Dmitry Volkov," Tommy introduced, gesturing to a massive Russian man with a shaved head and a scar running from his left eye to his chin. "He's going to teach you things I can't." Dmitry looked Marco up and down with cold grey eyes, then grunted. "You say boy wants to learn to kill. He looks soft." "I'm not soft," Marco said quietly, meeting the Russian's gaze without flinching. Something flickered across Dmitry's scarred face. Perhaps approval. "We see. Come." For 6 weeks that summer and every summer that followed, Marco trained with Dmitry and a rotating cast of specialists that Tommy recruited from the shadows of the criminal underworld. Former Spetsnaz soldiers, Irish Republican Army veterans, Japanese Yakuza enforcers, Mexican cartel sicarios. Each one taught him their craft. Dmitry taught him close-quarters combat, the brutal efficiency of Russian military hand-to-hand techniques designed to kill quickly and quietly. He learned how to turn everyday objects into weapons, how to break bones with leverage and positioning rather than brute force. A man named Sean O'Malley, who had once been a sniper for the IRA, taught him patience and precision. They would spend hours in the forest, Marco lying motionless in camouflage, learning to control his breathing, his heartbeat, waiting for the perfect moment to take the shot. "Killing from distance is mercy," Sean told him in his thick Belfast accent, tobacco-stained fingers adjusting Marco's rifle sight. "You don't see their eyes, don't hear their last words. But you remember this, lad. Mercy is a luxury you might not always have." A stoic Japanese man named Takeshi, whose Yakuza tattoos covered most of his body, taught him the art of the blade. Not flashy, movie-style swordplay, but the economical, lethal cuts that had been perfected over centuries. "Blade is honest," Takeshi said in broken English, demonstrating a technique. "Blade requires you to be close, to commit. Gun, anyone can use. But blade separates warrior from pretender." And through it all, Tommy taught him the most important lesson, the politics of power. Late at night, after the physical training was done, Tommy would sit with Marco on the cabin's porch, nursing a whiskey while the boy drank water, and they talked about the real world, the world of organized crime, family loyalty, betrayal, and survival. "Your father controlled half of New York because people respected him," Tommy explained one night, the summer stars bright overhead. "Not because they feared him, though they did, but because when Salvatore Vitale gave his word, it was gold. He was brutal when he needed to be, but he was also fair. That's the balance, Marco. Fear without respect breeds rebellion. Respect without fear breeds weakness." "Who killed him?" Marco asked, not for the first time. Tommy was quiet for a long moment. "We're still working on that. The hit was professional, well planned. Could have been any of a dozen different crews who wanted him gone." "You're lying." Tommy looked sharply at the boy. "What? You know who did it. I can see it in your face whenever I ask." Marco's eyes were hard in the darkness. "You know, but you're not telling me." Tommy sighed, realizing he couldn't hide the truth from Marco forever. The kid was too smart, too observant. "We have suspicions, strong ones. But suspicions aren't proof, and in our world you don't make a move without proof. Otherwise you start a war you might not survive." "Tell me." "Marco." "Uncle Tommy." The boy's voice was steel. "Tell me." Tommy took a long drink, then set down his glass. "We think it was Victor Castellano, the Castellano family from Queens. Your father and Victor had been at odds for years over territory in Lower Manhattan. The week before it happened, your father had shut down 3 of Victor's gambling operations, made him look weak." "Victor Castellano," Marco repeated, committing the name to memory with the same focus he brought to everything. "Where is he?" "Still running things in Queens, untouchable. He's got the judges bought off, half the NYPD on his payroll, and enough soldiers that going after him would be suicide." "Not forever," Marco said quietly. "Nothing's untouchable forever." Tommy looked at the 14-year-old boy, No, not a boy anymore, not really, and felt a chill run down his spine. In Marco's voice, he heard an echo of Salvatore's cold certainty, that absolute confidence that had made him so dangerous. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Tommy thought, and this particular apple is growing into something even more dangerous than its father. Fall 2003. New York City. At 18, Marco Vitale graduated from St. Anthony's Catholic School with honors. Sister Margaret wept at the ceremony, proud of the young man he had become, unaware of the darkness that lay beneath his polished exterior. He had been accepted to Columbia University on a full academic scholarship. Tommy had insisted on maintaining the appearance of normalcy, but Marco's real education was taking place in the shadows of New York City. Tommy had gradually introduced him to the family business, starting with low-level operations. Marco worked as a collector, visiting businesses that owed money to Tommy's organization. He never had to threaten anyone. His presence alone, calm, cold, utterly confident, was usually enough. But when it wasn't enough, Marco showed a capacity for violence that shocked even hardened criminals. There was the night a small-time drug dealer named Ray Dominguez decided he didn't need to pay his debts. Marco found him in a bar in Washington Heights, surrounded by his crew, all of them armed. "You got a lot of balls coming here alone, kid," Ray had sneered, his hand on the gun tucked into his waistband. Marco had smiled, a cold, empty expression that never reached his eyes. "I'm not alone. I'm just early." Before Ray could react, Marco moved. He shattered a beer bottle against the bar and drove the jagged edge into Ray's gun hand, pinning it to the wooden surface. While Ray screamed, Marco calmly explained what would happen if the money wasn't delivered by morning. The money was delivered with an hour to spare. Word spread through the underworld. Tommy Marconi had a protege, and he was his father's son in every terrifying way. But Marco wasn't just building a reputation through violence. He was building something else, a network. During his training sessions with specialists from different criminal organizations around the world, Marco had made connections. He remembered names, faces, grudges, and debts. He reached out to soldiers who felt underappreciated by their bosses, to enforcers who were tired of taking orders, to assassins who wanted to work with someone who understood their craft. One by one, he recruited them. Not to Tommy's organization, Tommy didn't even know about most of them, but to something that existed only in Marco's mind. Something he was building brick by brick, connection by connection, favor by favor. An army of ghosts, loyal only to him. By the time he was 23, Marco had over 50 men who owed him allegiance. Soldiers scattered across the country and beyond. Former Navy SEALs who had gone private. Russian mob enforcers, Colombian sicarios, Chinese triad members, Japanese yakuza. They came from everywhere, united by a single common thread. Marco Vitale had helped them when they needed it, and now they would help him. Tommy finally confronted him about it in the spring of 2008. "You're building something I don't understand," Tommy said, facing Marco across his desk in the back office of a legitimate construction company Tommy used as a front. "These men you're recruiting, they don't answer to me. They answer to you. Why?" Marco, now 23 and wearing a tailored suit that made him look like a Wall Street banker rather than a gangster, met his uncle's gaze calmly. "Because I'm going to need them." "For what?" "For what I've always been preparing for, Uncle Tommy." "You know what?" Tommy's face darkened. "Victor Castellano? Marco, I told you. You told me he was untouchable. That going after him would start a war." Marco leaned forward, his voice quiet but intense. "But Uncle Tommy, I don't plan on just going after him. I plan on burning his entire organization to the ground. And then I'm going after everyone else who had a hand in my father's death. You don't even know who all was involved." "Yes, I do." Marco pulled out a thick folder and dropped it on the desk. "I've spent the last 5 years investigating." Victor gave the order, but the hit team was supplied by the Russo family from New Jersey. The guns came from a Croatian arms dealer named Marko Petrovic. The timing was coordinated with Frank Chen from the Chinatown Syndicate, who made sure my father's usual security detail was reassigned that night. Tommy opened the folder with trembling hands, finding detailed dossiers on each person Marco had named, complete with photographs, addresses, daily routines, weaknesses. "My God, Marco, this is comprehensive." "I know." Marco stood, buttoning his jacket. "I've been patient, Uncle Tommy, just like you taught me. I've learned. I've prepared. I've built my network, but the time for patience is almost over. If you do this, you'll tear New York apart. Every family will be drawn into it. Good. Let them come. I'm ready. Tommy grabbed Marco's arm, his voice desperate. This isn't what your father would have wanted. Sal wanted you to have a normal life, to stay away from all this. Marco's expression didn't change, but his eyes grew colder. My father was murdered in front of me when I was 10 years old. That ended any chance I had at a normal life. You know that, Uncle Tommy. You've known it since that first morning you started training me in your basement. He gently pulled his arm free. I'm not angry with you. You did what you thought was right. You tried to make me strong enough to protect myself, but you need to understand something. I didn't just become strong. I became something else entirely. Something that my father never was. And what's that? Marco walked to the door, then paused, looking back over his shoulder. Patient enough to plan the perfect revenge, and cold enough to see it through, no matter the cost. Winter, 2010. 5 years later, 25-year-old Marco Vitale stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse apartment in Manhattan, watching the city lights glitter like a field of fallen stars. Snow was falling softly, coating New York in a blanket of white that would be brown slush by morning. Behind him, his apartment was sparse but elegant. Modern furniture, expensive art on the walls, a grand piano he actually knew how to play. To anyone who visited, he appeared to be a successful young businessman who had made his fortune in tech investments and real estate. Only a handful of people knew the truth. His phone buzzed. A text from Tommy. We need to talk. Some things happened. Marco texted back. Your office? 1 hour. He finished his whiskey, staring at his reflection in the glass. He barely recognized the man looking back at him. The scared 10-year-old boy who had hidden under a table while his father died might as well have been a different person. That boy was gone. In his place stood someone harder, colder, more dangerous. But also, Marco realized with a flicker of something that might have been regret, lonelier. He had acquaintances, associates, soldiers. But friends? People he truly cared about? Those had been sacrificed years ago in service of his singular goal. Almost time, he thought, touching the window with one finger, feeling the cold glass. 15 years. 15 years of preparation. Are you watching, Papa? Are you proud or disappointed? He grabbed his coat and headed out into the New York night, unaware that across the city, events were already in motion that would force his hand sooner than he'd planned. Victor Castellano had just made a fatal mistake, and Marco Vitale was about to show New York City what happened when you killed a king in front of his heir. The boy they had dismissed as insignificant was about to become the most dangerous man in New York, and he wouldn't come alone. New York City, March 2010. The warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn, smelled of salt water, rust, and old blood. Pools of light from flickering fluorescent bulbs cut through the darkness, illuminating scattered shipping containers and forgotten machinery that cast long skeletal shadows across the concrete floor. Marco Vitale stood in the center of this industrial graveyard, hands in the pockets of his black wool coat, his breath forming small clouds in the cold March air. Around him, arranged in a loose semicircle like an audience awaiting a performance, stood 50 men. Not soldiers, not yet. Ghosts. Each one had traveled here from a different corner of the underworld, answering Marco's call. There was Ivan Kuznetsov, the Russian enforcer with dead eyes and steady hands, who could disassemble and reassemble any firearm blindfolded. Diego Morales, the Colombian sicario who had escaped from 3 different maximum security prisons. James Reaper Washington, former Force Recon Marine turned contract killer. Hiroshi Tanaka, Yakuza exile with 37 confirmed kills, and 350 more just like them, waiting in the shadows. But these 50, these were his council, his commanders, the ones who would lead the army he had spent 15 years assembling. Tommy Marconi stood off to the side, arms crossed, his weathered face a mask of concern and resignation. When Marco had told him what was about to happen, Tommy had tried one last time to talk him out of it, but they both knew those words were merely a formality, like last rites for a man already condemned. Thank you for coming, Marco began, his voice carrying clearly in the cavernous space despite speaking at normal volume. Some of you have known me for years, others we've only recently connected, but all of you share something in common. You're tired of working for men who don't appreciate what you bring. who see you as tools to be used and discarded. He began to walk slowly along the line of men, making eye contact with each one. I'm not asking you to work for me. I'm asking you to work with me. What I'm building isn't a traditional organization with bosses and soldiers, with hierarchies and territories. What I'm building is something new, a network of professionals united by mutual respect and mutual profit. Pretty words, called out a voice from the back. A scarred Italian man named Giacomo stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. But we all know why we're really here. You're Salvatore Vitale's son. You want revenge on Victor Castellano and everyone else who helped kill your father. You want us to fight your war. Marco stopped, turning to face Giacomo directly. You're absolutely right. The admission hung in the air. Several men shifted uncomfortably. I'm not going to lie to you or dress this up as something it's not, Marco continued. Yes, I want revenge. Victor Castellano murdered my father in front of me 15 years ago. Him and 3 other families conspired to eliminate the one man who kept the peace in this city. They thought his death would give them power. Instead, it gave me purpose. He pulled out his phone and projected an image onto the warehouse wall, a photograph of Victor Castellano leaving his social club in Queens, surrounded by bodyguards. In 3 days, I'm going to kill Victor Castellano, not just him, his entire operation, his lieutenants, his captains, his soldiers who were there that night. I'm going to dismantle everything he's built and scatter the ashes. Murmurs rippled through the assembled men. The Russo family in New Jersey, the Chen syndicate in Chinatown, Marko Petrovich's weapons network, they'll all fall. And when the dust settles, New York will be ours. Not as conquerors, but as the new order, fair, profitable, and absolutely ruthless to anyone who tries to destroy it. And if we say no, Giacomo challenged. If we walk away? Marco smiled, though it never reached his eyes. Then you walk away. No hard feelings, no consequences. I'm not Victor Castellano, killing people for refusing to follow orders. But, he paused, letting the moment stretch. If you walk away, you'll miss the opportunity to be part of something that will reshape organized crime in America. You'll miss the payday of your lives, and you'll spend the rest of your career wondering, what if? He looked around at all of them. I'm offering you a choice that my father never got. Stand with me, and we'll build something better than what came before. Or walk away, and I'll still remember you as someone who at least heard me out. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Ivan Kuznetsov, the Russian, stepped forward. I'm in. His accent was thick, but his words were clear. Your father once helped my brother escape back to Moscow when the FBI was hunting him. Vitale family has my loyalty. Diego Morales nodded. In Medellin, we say blood must answer blood. Your father's blood calls for justice. I will help deliver it. One by one, the others stepped forward. Even Giacomo, after a moment's hesitation, nodded his agreement. All right, Vitale, I'm in. But not just because of revenge. I'm in because you're right. The old ways are broken. Time for something new. Marco felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not quite joy, not quite satisfaction, perhaps validation. After 15 years of preparation, of sacrifice, of becoming something he wasn't sure his father would recognize, people were finally standing with him. Thank you, he said simply. Tommy will brief you on the specifics. We have 3 days to finalize positions, weapons, and contingencies. This needs to be precise, clean, overwhelming. When we hit them, there can't be any room for them to recover or retaliate. As the men dispersed to hear their individual assignments from Tommy, Marco walked to the warehouse's far end, where massive windows overlooked the East River, and beyond it, the glittering skyline of Manhattan. He heard footsteps behind him, Tommy's familiar gait. You're really doing this, Tommy said quietly. I told you I would. Salvatore would be... Tommy stopped, struggling with the words. I don't know if he'd be proud or horrified, to be honest. Marco turned to look at his uncle, this man who had raised him, trained him, shaped him into what he'd become. Tommy looked older now, his hair almost fully grey, deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. Uncle Tommy, do you remember what I asked you to teach me? That first night after Papa died? You asked me to make you strong. No, I asked you to make me like Papa, to make sure nobody could ever hurt me again. Marco looked back out at the city. But that's not what I became, is it? Papa was strong, but he was also merciful. He believed in honor, in the old codes. That's what got him killed. Mercy, honor, trust. Marco, I'm not like him, Marco continued, his voice flat. I'm what he would have become if he'd lived through what I lived through. I'm the evolution, the adaptation. And tomorrow night, New York is going to learn what happens when you create something like me." Tommy was silent for a long moment. "Then, what happens after? After Castellano and the others are dead? What then?" Marco smiled, and for just a moment, Tommy saw a glimpse of the boy he used to be, the 10-year-old who loved his father and had dreams of a normal life. "Then I finally get to rest, maybe travel, see Rome, like Papa always wanted to. Maybe." The vulnerable moment passed, his expression hardening again. "But first, I have a war to win." The next evening, Victor Castellano's estate, Queens. Victor Castellano's mansion in Forest Hills, Queens, looked like something from a mob movie, ostentatious, tasteless, and fortified like a castle. High walls, security cameras, armed guards patrolling the grounds. Victor had gotten paranoid in his old age, surrounding himself with layers of protection that he believed made him untouchable. He was 62 years old now, gray-haired and thick around the middle, no longer the lean young enforcer who had murdered his way to the top of the Castellano family. But he was still dangerous, still connected, still convinced of his own invincibility. Tonight, he sat in his study, smoking a Cuban cigar and reviewing reports from his captains. Business was good. The gambling operations were thriving. The drug shipments from Colombia were moving smoothly, and the protection rackets in 3 boroughs were generating steady income. Life was good when you were on top. A knock at his door. His consigliere, Paulie Grimaldi, entered with a worried expression. "Boss, we got a problem." Victor sighed. "What now?" "Some of our guys down at the docks. They didn't report in for their shift." Carlo went to check on them, found the warehouse empty. No guards, no product, just gone. Victor's cigar paused halfway to his mouth. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" "I mean vanished, boss. And it's not just the docks. We're getting reports from 3 of our gambling houses in Astoria. Nobody's there. It's like everyone just disappeared." A cold feeling settled in Victor's gut. He hadn't survived 40 years in organized crime by ignoring his instincts, and right now those instincts were screaming danger. "Lock it down," he ordered, standing up. "Double the guards here, call everyone in, and find out what the hell is—" The lights went out. Total darkness engulfed the mansion, the only illumination coming from Victor's cigar ember and the faint glow of the city lights through the window. "Paulie." "I'm here, boss." The sound of a gun being drawn. "Stay close." "I'll—" The window exploded inward. Glass shards flew through the air like crystalline shrapnel. Dark figures poured through the opening, moving with military precision. Victor lunged for his desk, reaching for the gun in the drawer, but he never made it. A hand grabbed his wrist, twisting it behind his back with brutal efficiency. Another hand seized his throat, forcing him down onto his own desk. He tried to scream, but the pressure on his windpipe reduced it to a strangled wheeze. The lights came back on. Victor found himself staring into a pair of dark eyes, cold, intelligent, completely merciless. The young man holding him down was maybe 25, wearing tactical gear that looked military grade. But it wasn't the gear that made Victor's blood turn to ice. It was the eyes. He'd seen those eyes before. 15 years ago in a restaurant called Carbone's, belonging to a 10-year-old boy cowering under a table while his father bled out on the floor. "Marco Vitale," Victor gasped. "Hello, Victor." Marco's voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "It's been a while." Around the study, Victor's guards lay unconscious or dead. He couldn't tell which. Paulie was on his knees, a gun pressed to the back of his head by a massive Russian man. "How did you— the security— Your head of security, Bobby Torino. He's been working for me for 6 months. Made it very easy to get past your defenses." Marco increased the pressure slightly on Victor's throat. "Did you really think your fortress was impregnable? Nothing is, Victor. You should know that. After all, you proved it the night you murdered my father." Victor's mind raced, looking for an angle, any angle. "Marco, listen. Whatever you think happened, it wasn't personal. It was business. Your father, he was in the way of—" "Business." Marco's expression didn't change. "You killed my father, destroyed my childhood, and created what I am today because of business." He released Victor's throat and stepped back, gesturing for his men to pull the older man upright. Victor slumped into his desk chair, massaging his neck, his eyes darting around the room looking for an escape that didn't exist. "Where are my men?" Victor demanded, trying to maintain some dignity. "What did you do to them?" Your soldiers at the docks, your dealers in Astoria, your collection crews in Flushing, they're all currently zip-tied in a warehouse watching educational videos about career alternatives. Marco pulled up a chair and sat down across from Victor, completely relaxed. I didn't kill them, if that's what you're worried about. Most of them were just guys trying to make a living. They didn't pull the trigger that night. But I did. Victor understood now. You've come for revenge. Revenge implies emotion, Victor. This is something colder than that. This is... Marco seemed to consider his words carefully. Justice. Delayed, but not forgotten. So kill me already, Victor spat, some of his old defiance returning. Get it over with. Oh, I will, but first I need information. The other 3 families who helped you plan my father's murder, the Russos, the Chen Syndicate, and Marko Petrovich. I need to know where they are, how they operate, their security details. Victor laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You think I'm gonna rat? After 40 years, you think I'm gonna... The Russian behind Paulie pulled the trigger. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the enclosed study. Paulie's body jerked once, then collapsed forward, blood pooling beneath him. Victor's laughter died in his throat. That was your consigliere, Marco said calmly, as if discussing the weather. Your oldest friend, if I remember correctly. You've known him since you were teenagers, right? Grew up together in Bensonhurst? He leaned forward, and Victor saw something in his eyes that was worse than anger, worse than hatred. Emptiness. Complete, emotional void. I have 400 men spread throughout this city right now, Victor. Men who are very, very good at making people talk and making people disappear. I can kill everyone you've ever cared about. Your sons, your grandchildren, your mistress in that apartment in Murray Hill. And I can make it look like accidents, heart attacks, random muggings. Or, Marco's voice softened slightly. You can tell me what I want to know and I'll make this quick. Just you, clean, professional, and your family lives. Victor stared at the body of his oldest friend, then back at Marco. He had faced down killers before. Threatened and been threatened, played the game of violence and intimidation for decades. But this was different. This wasn't a man. It was something wearing a man's face. This was what you got when you traumatized a child and then gave him 15 years to prepare. The Russos, Victor said finally, his voice hoarse, operated out of a social club in Hoboken. Vincent Russo, the boss, he's paranoid as hell now, barely leaves his compound. Frank Chen expanded into Manhattan, has offices in a legitimate import-export company on Canal Street. Petrovich, he hesitated. Petrovich, Marco prompted. He's out of the country. Croatia. Had some trouble with the feds, fled back home last year. I know, I visited him 2 weeks ago. He's very talkative when you've got his entire family surrounded. Marco stood. But thank you for confirming the details about the Russos and Chen. That's all I needed. Wait, you said you'd make it quick, and I will. Marco nodded to one of his men, Hiroshi Tanaka, the Japanese exile. Clean, professional, he won't feel a thing. Hiroshi moved forward, drawing a blade that gleamed in the study's light. Marco! Victor's voice rose in panic. Your father, Salvatore, he was honorable. He wouldn't want this. He wouldn't... My father is dead, Victor. You made sure of that. Marco walked toward the shattered window, not even looking back. This is what you created. Live with it. Or rather, don't. He stepped through the window into the cold March night, leaving Victor Castellano to his fate. Behind him a scream cut short, then silence. Marco stood in Victor Castellano's garden, surrounded by his men, breathing in the cold air. Around him the mansion was being systematically cleared. Victor's remaining soldiers were being rounded up, given a choice: walk away from the life or join Marco's organization. Most chose to walk away. Tommy approached, his face pale in the moonlight. It's done? It's done. 1 down. 3 to go. Marco, when does it end? When do you stop? Marco looked at his uncle, this man who had tried so hard to save him, to guide him, to give him what his father couldn't. When they're all dead. When every person who had a hand in my father's murder has paid the price. Then he trailed off, uncertain himself what came after. Then I figure out who I am besides my father's son. Tommy gripped his shoulder. Your father loved you, Marco. More than anything in this world. I hope you know that. I hope you remember that when all this is over. I know. Marco's voice was soft, almost vulnerable. That's what makes this so hard. Because I'm doing everything he didn't want me to do. Becoming everything he tried to protect me from. But I can't stop, Uncle Tommy. I can't. This thing inside me, This need, it won't let me rest until it's finished." They stood there in silence for a moment, nephew and uncle, killer and guardian, bound together by loyalty and love and regret. "Let's go," Marco finally said. "We have a lot of work to do before sunrise." 2 weeks later, Hoboken, New Jersey. Vincent Russo's compound was a converted factory in Hoboken's industrial district, all brick and steel, with armed guards visible on the roof and electronic surveillance covering every approach. He'd heard about Victor Castellano's death, of course. Everyone had. The news had exploded through the underworld like wildfire. The mighty Victor Castellano, one of the 5 family's most powerful bosses, executed in his own home by Salvatore Vitale's son, who had returned from the shadows with an army at his back. Vincent had immediately gone to ground, surrounding himself with twice his usual security, reaching out to his allies for support. But allies were suddenly hard to find. Frank Chen wasn't returning calls. The other families were staying neutral, unwilling to take sides in what they saw as a blood vendetta, and the men Vincent had counted on, soldiers who had sworn loyalty, were deserting in droves, terrified of Marco Vitale's reputation. He sat in his reinforced bunker office, watching security feeds on multiple monitors, a shotgun within arm's reach, waiting for the attack he knew was coming. It came at 3 a.m., not with explosions or gunfire, but with silence. The security feeds went dark one by one. Vincent grabbed his shotgun, screaming for his guards, but heard only silence in response. His hand shook as he reached for his phone, trying to call for backup. The door to his office opened. Marco Vitale walked in as casually as if he were visiting a friend, dressed in a dark suit, hands in his pockets. Behind him, the bodies of Vincent's personal guards lay unconscious in the hallway. "Hello, Vincent." Vincent raised the shotgun with trembling hands. "Stay back, I'll blow your head off." "No, you won't." Marco's voice was utterly calm. "Because you're a survivor, Vincent. You've spent 40 years surviving in this business by knowing when to fight and when to fold. Right now, your brain is telling you that fighting is suicide." He was right, and Vincent knew it. His finger hovered over the trigger, but he couldn't pull it. Couldn't give the order that would end his life. "What do you want?" Vincent lowered the shotgun slightly. "I want you to understand something." Marco pulled up a chair and sat down, completely relaxed despite the weapon pointed at him. "My father didn't want this life for me. He wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer or anything legitimate. He tried so hard to keep me away from the blood and the violence. And then you and Victor and Chen and Petrovich took that choice away from me. It wasn't personal." "It was always personal." The sudden fury in Marco's voice made Vincent flinch. It was the first real emotion he'd shown. "You didn't just kill a mob boss. You killed a father in front of his son. You murdered the only person in the world who loved me unconditionally. And for what? Territory? Money? Pride?" Marco stood, pacing the office like a caged animal. "I've spent 15 years becoming what my father feared I would become. I've learned to kill without remorse, to manipulate without conscience, to command men who live in darkness. I've sacrificed every chance at a normal life, every possibility of love or happiness or peace, all in service of this singular goal." He stopped pacing and looked directly at Vincent. "So yes, Vincent, it's personal. It will always be personal." "Then kill me and get it over with," Vincent said, some of his old fire returning. "I'm not going to beg." "I know." Marco nodded with something almost like respect. "That's why your death will be quick. Unlike Victor's." He gestured, and James Reaper Washington stepped into the room, his presence radiating cold professionalism. "Wait," Vincent said suddenly. "My family, my wife, my daughters, they had nothing to do with your father's death." "I know. They won't be touched. Unlike Victor, you weren't there that night. You just provided logistical support. The safe house where the hit team planned, the police contacts who made sure cops didn't respond too quickly. You're guilty, but not as guilty as the others." Marco turned toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Vincent, you should have chosen better allies. Victor was always going to get you killed eventually. I just beat him to it." He left, and Vincent Russo, survivor of 4 decades of mob wars, betrayals, and violence, closed his eyes and waited for the end. It came quickly, just as promised. 1 month later, Canal Street, Chinatown. Frank Chen had always considered himself smarter than the other old-school mobsters. While they clung to tradition and honor, Frank embraced the modern world. He laundered money through cryptocurrency, used encrypted communications, kept his operations lean and anonymous. When Marco Vitali came for Victor and Vincent, Frank had watched from afar, confident that his digital fortress would protect him. He was wrong. Diego Morales and his team of tech-savvy operatives had spent weeks penetrating Frank's security. They tracked his encrypted phones, identified his safe houses, mapped his entire network. When they finally came for him, Frank was in a restaurant in Chinatown surrounded by his soldiers, eating Peking duck and feeling secure. Marco slid into the booth across from him as if he'd been invited. "Hello, Frank." Frank's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when he felt the cold press of a pistol against his ribs beneath the table. Diego smiled at him from the next booth over. "How?" Frank whispered. "My security was excellent. Really top-notch." Marco flagged down a waiter and ordered tea as if they were old friends catching up. "But you made one critical mistake, Frank." "What?" "You thought technology made you safe, but technology is just a tool. At the end of the day, this business is still about people. Loyalty, fear, respect, and I've spent 15 years learning how to turn those things to my advantage." The tea arrived. Marco poured for both of them, the social ritual surreal given the circumstances. "3 of your lieutenants have been working for me for the past year," Marco continued casually. "Your head of security is currently having a very productive conversation with my associates. And your cryptocurrency accounts? We've been monitoring them for months. One command and everything you own disappears." Frank felt his world collapsing around him. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand what you did, Frank. I want you to look at me and see the consequences of your choices." Marco's voice hardened. "You helped plan my father's murder. You made sure his usual security wasn't there that night. You knew he was going to that restaurant with his 10-year-old son, and you helped make sure we'd be vulnerable. I was following orders from who? Victor? Victor's dead. Vincent? Also dead. Petrovich?" Marco smiled coldly. "His body was found in the Adriatic Sea 3 weeks ago. You're the last one, Frank. The last person who needs to answer for what you did." Frank's hands trembled as he lifted his teacup. Around them, the restaurant continued its normal business, patrons unaware that a man's life was ending in their midst. "My family will inherit your legitimate businesses. I'm not a monster, Frank. I don't punish people for their relatives' crimes." Marco stood, leaving money on the table for the tea. "But you died tonight. Because 15 years ago you helped murder my father, and that debt comes due." He walked out of the restaurant into the Chinatown night. Behind him, Diego and his team escorted Frank Chen out through the back. He would be found 3 days later in the East River. His death ruled a gang-related murder by police, who were too overwhelmed or too corrupt to investigate further. 2 weeks later, Manhattan. Marco stood once again at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, watching snow fall over New York City. But this time the weight he'd carried for 15 years felt lighter. They were all dead. Victor Castellano, Vincent Russo, Frank Chen, Marco Petrovich, everyone who had participated in his father's murder had paid the price. Justice, cold, calculated, absolute, had been served. Tommy knocked on the open door behind him. "Are you okay, kid?" Marco turned, and for the first time in years, Tommy saw something in his nephew's eyes besides that cold, driven intensity. He saw exhaustion, relief, and underneath it all, the faint echo of the boy he used to be. "It's done, Uncle Tommy. It's finally done." "Yeah." Tommy walked over, standing beside him at the window. "So now what? You've got 400 men who followed you into this war. What happens to them?" "What happens to you?" Marco was quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking about that. About what comes next." He gestured at the city below. "New York is ours now. The power vacuum left by the old families. We're filling it. But I don't want to build what they had. I don't want to create another system built on betrayal and fear. What do you want?" "I want what my father tried to build before they killed him. Order, fairness. A code that actually means something." Marco turned to face his uncle. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not a criminal, Uncle Tommy. I am. I've killed people. I've built my power on violence and intimidation. But maybe," he paused, searching for the right words, "maybe I can be the last one who had to. Maybe I can build something that prevents another 10-year-old from watching his father die." Tommy put his hand on Marco's shoulder. "Your father would be proud of you. Not for the killing, but for this, for wanting to build something better." "You think so?" "I know so." Tommy smiled sadly. "Sal always said the next generation should have it better than we did. Looks like you're going to try to make that happen." A phone buzzed. Not Marco's, but the secure line that only his inner circle could access. He answered it, listened for a moment, then hung up with a frown. "Problem?" Tommy asked. "Maybe. Word is spreading about what we did. Other organizations in other cities are paying attention. Some are nervous. Some are interested in working with us. And some," Marco's jaw tightened, "some see opportunity. Think that hitting us now, while we're still consolidating power, would be smart. Then I guess the war's not over yet." Marco looked out at the city, his city now, and nodded slowly. "No, I guess it's not. But Uncle Tommy, I'm ready. For the first time in 15 years, I actually feel ready for whatever comes next. That's because you're not carrying that weight anymore. Revenge, it's like a poison. Once it's out of your system, you can finally breathe again." "Maybe." Marco allowed himself a small smile. "Or maybe I'm just too tired to tell the difference." They stood together in comfortable silence, guardian and ward, watching the snow fall over New York City. Somewhere out there in the darkness, 400 soldiers waited for their next command. Somewhere out there, new threats were mobilizing. But for tonight, just tonight, Marco Vitale allowed himself to feel something, besides the cold fury that had driven him for so long. He allowed himself to feel hope. New York City, 6 months later, September 2010. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Midtown Manhattan office building was designed to look like any legitimate corporate boardroom. Sleek table, ergonomic chairs, panoramic views of the city skyline. But the men gathered around that table represented anything but legitimate business. Marco Vitale sat at the head, now 25 years old, and looking every inch the modern criminal kingpin. Gone were the tactical clothes and weapons of his revenge campaign. Instead, he wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, his dark hair styled professionally, diamond cufflinks catching the light. To his right sat Tommy Marconi, serving as consigliere, his weathered face mapping decades of experience in the underworld. To his left was Ivan Kuznetsov, head of security operations. Around the rest of the table, Diego Morales managing drug and smuggling operations, James Washington overseeing enforcement, Hiroshi Tanaka running weapons distribution, and 15 others, each representing a different facet of the empire Marco had built from the ashes of the old families. But today's meeting wasn't about business as usual. "Gentlemen," Marco began, his voice calm, but carrying the authority of absolute command. "We have a problem." He pressed a button on the remote control before him, and a photograph appeared on the large screen at the room's far end. It showed a balding white man in his 50s with cold, calculating eyes. Frank Moretti. He runs most of Chicago now, controls significant operations in Detroit and Cleveland. He's been making moves in our territory. Specifically, he's been recruiting our people, offering them better deals, trying to fracture our organization from the inside. "How many have we lost?" Tommy asked, his voice tight. 17 soldiers in the past month. Not huge numbers, but concerning. Moretti's approach is subtle. He's not challenging us directly, just slowly bleeding us out. Giacomo, the Italian who had questioned Marco's leadership 6 months ago but was now one of his most loyal commanders, leaned forward. "We could hit him. Send a team to Chicago, make an example." "No," Marco interrupted firmly. "That's exactly what he wants. He's trying to bait us into a war that will cost us resources, attention, and legitimacy. We respond with violence, and we look like the old families. Reactionary, short-sighted, controlled by our emotions." "So what do we do?" Diego asked, his Colombian accent still thick despite years in New York. "Let him steal our men?" Marco stood, walking to the window and looking out at the city. "We remind him why the old approach doesn't work anymore. And we do it smartly." He turned back to face the assembled men, and they saw the familiar cold calculation in his eyes, the mind that had orchestrated the downfall of 4 different crime families in less than 2 months. "Moretti thinks he understands what we are. He sees us as just another mob, operating on the same principles as everyone else: power, fear, territory. He doesn't realize we've evolved beyond that. So we're going to educate him." 3 days later, Chicago, Illinois. Frank Moretti's headquarters was a legitimate-looking restaurant called Giordano's, famous for its deep-dish pizza and quietly infamous as the nerve center of Moretti's criminal empire. The basement beneath the restaurant held offices, counting rooms, and a well-equipped armory. Moretti sat in his private office, reviewing financial reports and feeling quite pleased with himself. His Chicago operation was thriving, his expansion into New York was proceeding better than expected, and that young punk Marco Vitale hadn't even responded to his provocations. Kids these days, Moretti thought with satisfaction. No spine. Salvatore Vitale would have already started a war, but his son just sits there and takes it. His lieutenant, a heavy-set man named Carmine, knocked and entered. "Boss, we got those financial statements you wanted from the ports operation." "Good, good. Any word from our guys in New York?" 3 more of Vitale's people reached out, interested in switching sides. "I'm vetting them now, should know by—" Carmine stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale. "What is it?" Moretti looked up from his papers to see Marco Vitale standing in his office doorway, flanked by 2 men Moretti didn't recognize. "Hello, Frank," Marco said pleasantly. "I hope you don't mind us dropping by." Moretti's hand moved toward the gun in his desk drawer, but Ivan Kuznetsov was faster, his own weapon already drawn and pointed with steady precision. "I wouldn't," Ivan advised in his thick Russian accent. "Your security team is currently napping upstairs. We gave them strong recommendation to take break." Marco pulled up a chair and sat down across from Moretti, completely relaxed despite being deep in enemy territory. Behind him, the sounds of controlled chaos filtered down from the restaurant level, customers being evacuated, Moretti's soldiers being rounded up. "How did you—" "My security," Moretti sputtered. "Your head of security, Johnny D'Angelo. His sister works at a hospital in Newark. She had some trouble with medical bills. I took care of them. Funny how a simple act of kindness can buy such complete loyalty." Marco smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "See? That's the difference between you and me, Frank. You buy loyalty with fear and money. I buy it with respect and genuine care for my people's well-being. If you're here to kill me, I'm not." Marco held up his hands, showing he was unarmed. "If I wanted you dead, you'd be dead. No, Frank, I'm here because we need to have a conversation about boundaries and respect." Moretti tried to regain some composure, straightening his tie. "You don't scare me, kid. I've been doing this since you were in diapers." "I know, and that's precisely your problem. You're still operating like it's 1975. The world has changed, Frank. The business has changed. But men like you refuse to adapt." Marco leaned forward. "You've been trying to poach my soldiers, thinking you can fracture my organization. What you don't realize is that my soldiers aren't there because they fear me. They're there because they believe in what we're building." "And what's that? Some kind of criminal utopia?" Moretti laughed bitterly. "Something like that, actually." Marco's expression grew serious. "The old system was broken, Frank. It rewarded treachery, encouraged violence, made everyone paranoid and miserable. I've been creating something different. A network based on mutual benefit, clear rules, and actual justice. Revolutionary concepts, I know. Spare me the speech, kid. You're a killer trying to dress himself up as something noble. I know what you did to Victor Castellano and the others. Heard all the stories. You're just another thug with delusions of grandeur." Marco's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign that Moretti's words had hit a mark. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I am a killer. I've taken lives and I can't pretend otherwise. But here's what you need to understand. I became a killer because men like Victor Castellano, men like you, made me into one. You created this. And now you have to live with the consequences." He stood, straightening his jacket. "But I didn't come here to debate morality. I came here to make you an offer." "What offer?" "Stop your incursions into New York. Leave my people alone. In return, I'll stay out of Chicago. We divide the territories, establish clear boundaries, and maybe, just maybe, we avoid the bloodbath that would come from a prolonged war." Moretti studied Marco carefully. The kid was confident. He'd give him that. But was he bluffing? "And if I say no, then I destroy you." Marco's voice didn't rise, didn't change inflection, but the certainty in it was absolute. "Not quickly, not dramatically, systematically. I'll take apart your organization piece by piece. I'll turn your soldiers against you, dry up your revenue streams, corrupt your politicians and police contacts. Within 6 months, you'll be running a pizza shop in the suburbs and hoping I don't decide even that's too much." He walked to the door, then paused and looked back. "My father tried to build peace through respect and cooperation. It got him killed. So now I build peace through strength and certainty. People need to know that betraying our agreements has consequences. You, Frank, are going to be my example. either as someone who chose cooperation and thrived, or as someone who chose conflict and was destroyed. How do I know you'll keep your word? Moretti asked. How do I know you won't just take my territory once I back off? Because unlike the men who came before me, my word actually means something. Marco opened the door. You have 48 hours to decide. After that, I'll assume you've chosen war. Marco and his team made it out of Chicago without incident, another testament to the detailed planning and intelligence gathering that had become his trademark. On the private jet back to New York, Tommy sat beside him, studying his nephew's profile. You think he'll take the deal? Tommy asked. Yes, Marco said confidently. Moretti's smart enough to recognize when he's outmatched. He'll test our boundaries a few more times, push to see if our word really holds, but ultimately he'll fall in line. And if he doesn't, then we make good on our threat. Marco's voice was matter-of-fact. We dismantle his organization completely, but I don't think it will come to that. Moretti's a survivor, and survivors know when to adapt. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then, you've changed, Marco. The way you handled that. No violence, no threats of immediate physical harm, just strategic pressure. I've had time to think these past 6 months. Time to figure out what kind of leader I want to be. Marco stared out the window at the clouds below. When I was planning my revenge, all I cared about was making the people who killed my father pay. But now I have 400 men depending on me. Families depending on those men. Communities affected by our operations. I can't just be about revenge anymore. Your father would be proud, Tommy said softly. Would he? Marco turned to look at his uncle, and for a moment, Tommy saw vulnerability in those dark eyes. I've killed people, Uncle Tommy. A lot of people. I've lied, manipulated, threatened. I've become everything Papa tried to keep me away from. How can you say he'd be proud? Because he'd see what I see. A man trying to make something better out of something broken. You could have just taken power and ruled through fear like Victor and the others. Instead, you're trying to build something that might actually last. That takes courage. That takes vision. And yeah, kid, that takes honor. Marco smiled faintly. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if that night had gone differently, if Papa had survived. Would I have become a doctor like he wanted? Would I be happy? Maybe. But you can't live your life in the land of what if, Marco. You can only move forward with the hand you've been dealt. I know. Marco straightened his tie, his moment of vulnerability passing. And I'm going to play this hand perfectly. 6 weeks later, United Nations Plaza, Manhattan. The meeting was held in a private room of a luxury hotel near the UN. Neutral ground, secure, and deliberately symbolic. Marco had called together representatives from 15 different criminal organizations across the Northeast. Italian, Russian, Chinese, Irish, Albanian, every major group operating in the region. They came reluctantly, some curious, some hostile, all suspicious of this young upstart who had toppled the old order in New York and was now calling himself something between a kingpin and a peacemaker. Marco stood at the head of a massive conference table, looking more like a CEO about to give a shareholder presentation than a mob boss. Thank you all for coming, he began. I know many of you have concerns about recent changes in New York's power structure. You're worried about what my organization represents, what we want, whether we're a threat to your operations. I'm here to address those concerns directly. Sergei Volkov, a Russian mob boss from Brighton Beach, interrupted with a harsh laugh. You're here to tell us to bow down to new king, da? This is waste of time. No, Sergei, I'm here to propose something radical. Cooperation. The room erupted in overlapping voices, some laughing, some angry, all disbelieving. Marco waited for the noise to die down, then continued. The old system was based on territory and competition. Every family fighting for the same resources, the same power, constantly at each other's throats. It was inefficient, bloody, and ultimately unsustainable. That's why the old families fell. They were too busy fighting each other to see the bigger picture. He pressed a button and a presentation appeared on screens around the room. I'm proposing a different model. A confederation of independent organizations, each maintaining their own operations and identity, but working together on shared interests. Drug distribution networks that don't overlap. Weapons smuggling coordinated to avoid law enforcement attention. Money laundering infrastructure that benefits everyone. Politicians and police contacts shared rather than fought over. And who leads this confederation? Asked Li Ming, head of the Chinatown syndicate, who had filled the void after Frank Chen's death. You? No one leads it. We govern by consensus. Major decisions require two-thirds approval. Day-to-day operations remain independent. Think of it as the United Nations of organized crime, flawed, complicated, but better than constant warfare. This is fantasy, declared Patrick O'Brien, an Irish gang leader from Boston. You think we're going to trust each other, share power? We've been enemies for generations. Yes, you have. And what has that gotten you? Prison sentences, dead soldiers, constant territorial disputes that drain resources and attract law enforcement attention. Marco's voice grew passionate. I'm not asking you to love each other. I'm not even asking you to like each other. I'm asking you to be smart, to recognize that cooperation is more profitable and sustainable than conflict. Frank Moretti, who had indeed taken Marco's offer and was now present as an allied representative from Chicago, spoke up. The kid's right. I fought this idea at first, but since we've established clear boundaries with his organization, my Chicago operation has grown 30%. No more expensive turf wars, no more constant watching my back. We focus on business instead of conflict. Other voices chimed in, some supportive, some skeptical. The debate raged for hours, with Marco patiently addressing every concern, every objection, every suspicious question. Finally, as evening fell and the Manhattan skyline began to glitter with lights, Marco made his closing argument. Gentlemen, in the past century, how many of your predecessors died violently? How many went to prison? How many families were destroyed by this life? The old way doesn't work. We all know it. We keep doing it anyway because it's what we know, what our fathers and grandfathers did. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each boss present. I'm offering you a chance to break that cycle, to build something that might actually last beyond our lifetimes. To create a system where our children, should any of us be foolish enough to have them, don't have to live in constant fear of betrayal and violence. You talk about children, Sergei said thoughtfully. You have children, Marco Vitale? No. I've dedicated my life to building this. Relationships, family. Those are luxuries I gave up a long time ago. Marco's voice carried a hint of sadness. But maybe someday, if we succeed in building this new system, people like me won't have to make that sacrifice. The room fell silent, the criminal leaders confronted with the hollowness of their own victories, the prices they'd all paid for power. I want to hear more, Li Ming finally said. Terms, specifics, how disputes are resolved, how we ensure compliance. Me too, Patrick O'Brien agreed reluctantly. But I'm not promising anything. This could still be a trap. Fair enough, Marco said. Let's talk details. They talked until 3 a.m., hammering out the framework of what would come to be known as the Confederation, the most ambitious attempt to organize American criminal enterprises since the Commission of the 1930s. It wasn't perfect. Many bosses remained skeptical. Some would try to cheat the system. Others would eventually break away. But it was a start. 3 months later, December 2010, the first real test of the Confederation came on a freezing December night when word reached Marco that the Albanian crew in the Bronx was making moves to take over a drug distribution network that belonged to the Irish. Under the old system, this would have sparked immediate violence, drive-by shootings, firebombings, bodies in the street. Under the new system, Marco called an emergency meeting of the Confederation's council. The Albanian boss, a ruthless man named Drayton, argued his case. The Irish weren't maintaining their network properly, letting quality slip, allowing independents to muscle in. He was just claiming territory that wasn't being properly controlled. Patrick O'Brien countered that his people had been running those streets for 30 years, and some temporary quality issues didn't justify a hostile takeover. The debate grew heated, with both sides threatening to abandon the Confederation if they didn't get their way. Marco let them argue for an hour, watching, evaluating, waiting for the right moment to intervene. Finally, he stood. Gentlemen, we have a process for this. Drayton, you claim the Irish aren't maintaining standards. Patrick, you claim this is your territory by historical right. Here's my proposal. We send in neutral auditors, Russian crew, since they have no stake in this dispute, to evaluate both the quality issues and the territory claims. We gather actual data. Then we bring it back to this council and make a decision based on facts rather than emotions. And if the auditors say my operation is fine, Patrick demanded, then Drayton backs off completely. And if they say I'm right about quality issues, Drayton asked, then we work out a partnership arrangement. The Irish maintain territorial control, but the Albanians help improve operations, and both groups share the increased profits. Nobody loses face. Both sides gain. The two bosses looked at each other, neither happy but both willing to accept the compromise. "Fine," Patrick finally said, "but I want it on record. If those auditors are anything less than impartial, this whole thing falls apart." "Agreed," Drayton nodded. 2 weeks later, the auditors reported back, the Irish operation did have quality issues, but nothing that couldn't be fixed with better suppliers and tighter management. They recommended the partnership arrangement Marco had proposed. Both sides accepted. No one died. No one went to war. The Confederation's first major test was passed. When Tommy heard about it, he cornered Marco in his office. "You're actually doing it," Tommy said, something like wonder in his voice. "You're actually making this work." "One crisis at a time," Marco replied, but he couldn't hide the satisfaction in his voice. "It's not perfect. It'll never be perfect, but it's better than what came before." "Your father tried to build something like this once," Tommy said quietly. "Back in the late 80s, he called it the Accord, but Victor and the others sabotaged it. Said he was going soft, trying to diminish their power. That's what really started the tensions that led to—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Marco was quiet for a long moment. "I know. I found some of Papa's old notes when I was going through his things after he died. His vision for the Accord. It's what gave me the idea for the Confederation." "So you're finishing what he started?" "I'm trying. Sometimes I wonder if I'm honoring his memory or just using it as justification for what I've become." Marco looked out his office window at the snowy New York night. "But either way, this is the path I'm on now. Might as well walk it as well as I can." 1 year later, October 2011, on the 16th anniversary of Salvatore Vitale's death, Marco Vitale stood in the rain outside Carbone's restaurant. The place had been closed for years, a casualty of the neighborhood's economic changes and the dark reputation it had earned. But the building was still there, slowly decaying, windows boarded up, the awning tattered and faded. Marco had bought it 6 months ago, though he hadn't told anyone why. Now, standing in the October rain, the same kind of rain that had fallen that terrible night 16 years ago, he finally understood his own reasons. Tommy stood beside him, holding an umbrella, saying nothing. Some moments didn't require words. "I'm going to restore it," Marco finally said, "exactly as it was. The same tables, the same photos on the walls, the same menu. And then I'm going to donate it to the Historical Society, make it a landmark so people remember." "Remember what?" Tommy asked gently. "That violence has consequences, that every bullet fired, every life taken, ripples outward in ways we can't predict. That 10-year-old boy who watched his father die here, he became someone who changed the entire landscape of organized crime in this country. For better or worse, he became that, because of what happened in this building." Marco walked closer to the boarded-up entrance, placing his hand on the door. "Sometimes I dream I'm still that kid, hiding under the table. I see Papa falling. I see those cold blue eyes looking at me, dismissing me as nothing. And in the dream, I try to scream, try to warn him, but no sound comes out. I'm helpless, powerless, small." "But you're not that anymore," Tommy said. "No, I'm not." Marco turned to face his uncle, rain running down his face. "But Uncle Tommy, here's what scares me. I don't know if what I became is actually better. I built an empire. I created a new system. 400 men follow my orders. The Confederation is growing, changing how organized crime operates across the entire country. But at what cost? What did I sacrifice to become this?" Tommy considered his words carefully. "You sacrificed your innocence, your chance at a normal life, the person you might have been if your father had lived. Those are heavy prices, Marco. But you also created something that might prevent other 10-year-olds from going through what you did. You brought order to chaos. That's worth something." "Is it? Is it worth the people I've killed, the lines I've crossed? The fact that I sometimes can't feel anything except when I'm planning strategy or making moves against opponents?" "I don't know," Tommy admitted honestly. "But I know your father would want you to find a way to live with what you've done, to find some measure of peace, even if it's not perfect peace." They stood together in the rain, two men bound by blood and shared trauma, looking at the building where everything had changed. "I'm going to build something else," Marco said suddenly. "A foundation, the Salvatore Vitale Foundation. It'll provide support for children who've witnessed violence, Therapy, education, mentorship, legal, legitimate, completely separate from the Confederation. Your father would like that, Tommy said with a small smile, taking something terrible and making something good from it. Maybe that's all any of us can do. Take the cards we're dealt and play them as well as we can. Try to leave things a little better than we found them. Marco turned away from the restaurant. Come on, let's get out of this rain. Present day, 5 years later, October 2016. 31-year-old Marco Vitale sat in his Manhattan office, reviewing reports from Confederation representatives across 15 states. The organization had grown beyond his wildest expectations, not just surviving but thriving, reshaping how organized crime operated in America. Violence was down, cooperation was up. Even law enforcement had grudgingly acknowledged that crime, while still present, was more manageable under the new system, but success came with its own complications. Younger gangsters who hadn't lived through the chaotic violence of the old days were getting restless, challenging the Confederation's authority. International organizations, Russian, Chinese, Mexican, were probing for weaknesses, and the FBI had created a special task force specifically dedicated to understanding and dismantling the Confederation. Some days Marco felt like he was holding back a flood with his bare hands. His phone rang. The private line. Tommy. Uncle Tommy, what's up? Turn on the news, Channel 7. Marco grabbed the remote and switched on the television. A breaking news report showed a familiar face, Detective Angelo Russo, now retired but being interviewed about a true crime documentary. And I'll never forget that night, Russo was saying. The Salvatore Vitale murder. The way his son, Marco, just sat there in shock. I remember thinking that kid's life was destroyed, that he'd never recover from witnessing something so traumatic. The interviewer asked, "Do you know what happened to Marco Vitale?" Russo smiled sadly. "I've heard rumors. Some say he became a successful businessman. Others say, well, let's just say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But wherever he is, whatever he became, I hope he found some measure of peace. No child should have to carry that kind of trauma." Marco muted the television, feeling something twist in his chest. "You okay, kid?" Tommy asked over the phone. "Yeah, just strange to hear someone talk about me like that. Like I'm some tragic figure instead of..." He trailed off. "Instead of what?" "Instead of someone who chose this. Who became what he became deliberately, methodically, with full knowledge of the consequences." Marco stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city, his empire, his responsibility, his burden. "Sometimes I forget that I was ever that scared 10-year-old. Sometimes it feels like I've always been this. But you weren't, and you still aren't. Not entirely. The kid who loved his father, who wanted to make him proud, he's still in there, Marco. I've seen him." "Have you?" "Because some days I'm not sure." They were both quiet for a moment. Then Tommy said, "Listen, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. About that night. About what really happened." Marco's attention sharpened. "What do you mean?" "There was another person involved in planning your father's death. Someone I didn't tell you about because I was trying to protect you." Marco's voice went cold. "Who?" "Your father's younger brother. Your Uncle Leo. He was in witness protection, but he's been released. He's living in Arizona now, running a used car dealership under a new name." The silence on Marco's end was absolute. "Uncle Tommy?" he finally said, his voice deadly calm. "Are you telling me that my father's own brother helped arrange his murder?" Leo was deep in gambling debt. Victor threatened his family. He gave them information, when Sal would be vulnerable, where he'd be, when his security would be minimal. Leo didn't pull the trigger, but he made the hit possible. "And you didn't tell me because I knew what you'd do. And I knew that killing your blood relative, even one who betrayed your father, would destroy what little humanity you had left. I was trying to protect that last piece of the old Marco." Marco closed his eyes, his mind racing. Another name to add to the list, another betrayer to confront. After all these years, the poison still spreading, the consequences still unfolding. "Where exactly in Arizona?" Marco asked quietly. "Marco, don't..." "Where?" Tommy sighed, defeated. He gave Marco an address. After they hung up, Marco stood at his window for a long time, wrestling with himself. He had built something here in New York. He had created a system that, while imperfect, was better than what came before. He had tried to honor his father's memory by finishing what Salvatore had started, but here was another betrayer, Another person who had helped destroy his family, living free and unpunished. The cold part of him, the part that had been forged in that restaurant 16 years ago, whispered that justice demanded retribution, that his work wasn't finished until every person who had played a role in his father's death had paid the price. But another part, a smaller, quieter part that sounded suspiciously like his father's voice, whispered something different. Let it go, Marco. You've done enough. You've sacrificed enough. Don't let revenge consume what's left of your soul. For the first time in 16 years, Marco Vitale didn't immediately know which voice to listen to. 2 weeks later, Scottsdale, Arizona. The used car dealership sat on a sun-baked lot, American flags fluttering in the dry Arizona wind. Marco sat in his rental car across the street, watching a man in his 60s glad-hand customers, his smile wide, his manner friendly. Leonard Leo Rossini, formerly Leonardo Vitale, had aged since the old family photos. His hair was white, his face more lined, but Marco would have recognized him anywhere. He looked like an older, softer version of Salvatore, like what Papa might have looked like if he'd lived. Marco had been sitting here for an hour, his hand resting on the gun in the glove compartment, watching his uncle's new life play out in the afternoon sun. It would be so easy. Walk across the street, call Leo into his office, close the door. 3 shots, silenced. Gone before anyone even realized what happened. Justice served. But something held him back. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the realization that revenge was an endless appetite, never satisfied, always demanding more. Maybe it was the memory of Detective Russo's words. I hope he found some measure of peace. His phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. Hello? Mr. Vitale? This is Sister Margaret from St. Anthony's. Marco straightened, surprised. He hadn't spoken to Sister Margaret in years, though he'd continued to donate generously to the school. Sister, what can I do for you? I'm calling because we have a young man here, 11 years old, who's going through something similar to what you experienced. His father was killed in a gang-related shooting. The boy witnessed it. He's angry, Mr. Vitale. So angry. And I thought perhaps you might be willing to speak with him, to help him find a path forward that doesn't lead to more violence. Marco looked at Leo's car dealership, then down at the gun in his glove compartment. Give me his name and number, he said quietly. I'll call him tomorrow. Thank you. And Mr. Vitale, I know what you became, I'm not blind, but I also know that somewhere inside that man is still the boy who sat in my classroom, trying so hard to be good despite everything. I hope you find your way back to him. After they hung up, Marco sat in his car as the Arizona sun beat down. He thought about that 11-year-old boy waiting for him back in New York, a boy standing at the same crossroads Marco had stood at 16 years ago. He could go across that street, confront Leo, extract whatever bitter satisfaction revenge would bring, continue the cycle of violence and retribution that had defined his entire adult life. Or he could make a different choice. He could let it go. He could drive back to the airport, fly back to New York, and try to save one traumatized kid from becoming what he had become. It wasn't even really a choice, he realized. Not anymore. Marco started the engine and pulled away from the curb, leaving Leo Rossini to his sun-baked parking lot and second-chance life. He drove to the airport, booked the next flight to New York, and spent the entire journey thinking about what he would say to a boy whose father had been murdered. What wisdom could a killer offer an innocent? What hope could someone who had sacrificed his humanity offer to someone still fighting to keep theirs? But he would try, because if he couldn't save himself, maybe, just maybe, he could save someone else. 1 week later, St. Anthony's Catholic School, New York. The boy's name was Daniel Reyes. He was 11 years old, thin as a rail, with dark eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. Marco met him in Sister Margaret's office after school. Daniel sat rigidly in his chair, arms crossed, radiating defensive anger. Marco recognized that posture intimately. He'd worn it himself for years. Daniel, I'm Marco. Sister Margaret thought we should talk. I don't need to talk, Daniel said sullenly. I'm fine. No, you're not. Neither was I when I was your age and my father was murdered in front of me. That got the boy's attention. His eyes snapped up to meet Marco's. Your father was killed? Shot. Multiple times. I watched him die. I was 10 years old. Daniel's defensive posture softened slightly. What happened to the guys who did it? They died. All of them. I made sure of it. Marco saw the flash of satisfaction in Daniel's eyes and knew he'd reached a critical moment. But Daniel, that satisfaction I felt. It lasted maybe 5 minutes, then it was just hollow, empty, because my father was still dead, and all the revenge in the world couldn't bring him back. So what, I'm supposed to just forget about it? Let them get away with killing my dad? No, but you need to understand something. The path I took, the path of revenge, of violence, of letting your anger consume everything else in your life, it doesn't lead anywhere good. I'm 31 years old, and I've spent more than half my life being angry. Do you know what that feels like, to wake up every day and realize you can barely remember what it was like to be happy? Daniel was quiet, but Marco could see him processing the words. What should I do then? The boy asked, his voice small and lost. Live. Actually live. Not just exist. Honor your father's memory by becoming the man he would have wanted you to be. Go to college. Have friends. Fall in love. Build a life that means something beyond revenge. Marco leaned forward. Your father died, Daniel. That's the worst thing that could happen, but you don't have to die with him. You can choose to carry his memory forward in a way that doesn't destroy you. But I'm so angry, Daniel whispered, tears finally breaking through his tough exterior. All the time. I can't stop being angry. I know, and that anger might never completely go away. But you can learn to channel it into something besides revenge. Fight for justice, real justice, the legal kind. Become a lawyer or a cop or a social worker who helps kids like us. Use that fire inside you to make things better, instead of just burning everything down. Marco reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. This is for the Salvatore Vitale Foundation. They help kids who've witnessed violence. Therapy, mentorship, whatever you need. Will you call them? Will you at least try a different path than the one I took? Daniel took the card with trembling fingers. Did your dad want you to be like this? To do the things you did? The question cut Marco to his core. No, he wanted me to be better, to rise above the violence and the anger, to have the normal life he never could. Marco's voice was thick with emotion. I failed him in that. But you don't have to fail yours. They sat together in Sister Margaret's office for another hour, Marco sharing his story. Carefully edited but honest in the important ways. By the time Daniel left, something in his eyes had shifted. Not healed, not fixed, but different. Like maybe there was hope for a future that didn't end in blood and ashes. Sister Margaret walked Marco to the door. That was a good thing you did, she said. Maybe. Or maybe I just traumatized him more by showing him what he could become. No, you gave him a choice. That's more than most people in your position would do. She studied his face. How are you, Marco? Really? Tired, sister. So tired. Sometimes I wonder if I should just walk away from it all. The Confederation, the Empire, the responsibility, just disappear. Let someone else carry the weight. But you won't. No, I built this. I need to see it through. He smiled sadly. Maybe that's my penance, to spend my life trying to create something better than what came before, even though I can never escape what I had to do to build it. Redemption is a long road, Marco, but you're walking it. That's what matters. 6 months later, present day April 2017, Marco Vitale stood at the podium of the restored Carbone's restaurant, now officially opened as a historical landmark and community center. The old photographs had been restored and rehung. The tables were polished. The black and white checkered floor gleamed, though the section where his father had died had been replaced, marked with a subtle brass plaque that read, Salvatore Vitale, beloved father, 1955-1995. A small crowd had gathered for the opening ceremony. Community members, historical society representatives, and a few carefully vetted journalists. Tommy stood in the back, watching with pride and sadness as his nephew gave his speech. This building represents both a terrible tragedy and the possibility of transformation, Marco said, his voice carrying clearly through the restored dining room. What happened here changed many lives, including my own. But rather than let it remain a symbol of violence and loss, we've chosen to make it something else, a reminder that we can acknowledge the past without being imprisoned by it. He gestured to the back of the room, where the Salvatore Vitale Foundation had set up informational displays. The foundation works to help children and families affected by violence. We provide therapy, educational support, mentorship, everything my father would have wanted for young people trying to build better lives. This restaurant will serve as one of our community outreach centers, offering resources to anyone who needs them. After the ceremony, as people mingled and explored the restored space, Daniel Reyes approached Marco. The boy looked healthier now, his eyes clearer, his posture more relaxed. "Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Vitale." "Of course. How have you been?" "Better, the therapy helps, and I've been volunteering with the foundation. Sister Margaret says I'm good at talking to other kids who've been through stuff." Daniel hesitated. "I wanted to tell you. I decided what I want to do when I grow up. I'm going to be a social worker, help kids like us." Marco felt something crack in his chest, something that might have been joy or pride or the beginning of actual healing. "Your father would be proud of you, Daniel." "I think so too." The boy smiled. "What about yours? Is he proud of you?" Marco looked around the restored restaurant, at the community center his legitimate money had funded, at the foundation that was already helping hundreds of young people, at the boy standing before him, who had chosen a path of healing instead of revenge. "I hope so," he said honestly. "I really hope so." That night, Marco's penthouse Marco stood at his window one last time, looking out at New York City, his empire, his responsibility. His phone buzzed with messages from Confederation representatives, reports of operations, requests for decisions. The machine he'd built kept running, requiring constant attention, constant management. But tonight, just for tonight, he ignored them all. Instead, he pulled out an old photograph, one of the few he had saved from his childhood. It showed him at maybe 8 years old, sitting on his father's shoulders at Coney Island, both of them laughing, his father's hands gripping his ankles to keep him steady, the ocean stretching out behind them. He didn't remember what they'd been laughing about, couldn't recall what had made that day special enough to photograph. But looking at that picture, he could almost remember what it felt like to be happy, to be safe, to be loved unconditionally by someone who wanted nothing from him except for him to grow up healthy and whole. "I'm sorry, Papa," he whispered to the photograph. "I became everything you didn't want me to be. I've done terrible things, hurt people, killed people, built an empire on blood and fear and strategic necessity. But I'm really trying, to make something good from it, to help people like Daniel, to prevent other kids from going through what I went through. I hope that counts for something. I hope that somewhere, somehow you understand why I had to do what I did." The city lights glittered below him, indifferent to his pain, his regrets, his attempts at redemption. Tomorrow he would wake up and be Marco Vitale again, kingpin, strategist, architect of the Confederation. He would make decisions that affected thousands of lives, balance competing interests, navigate the endless complications of power. But tonight, just for tonight, he let himself be that scared 10-year-old boy again, the one who missed his father, the one who wished things could have been different, the one who still, after everything, just wanted to make his papa proud. Outside, the October wind blew cold off the East River, carrying with it the ghosts of 16 years of choices, sacrifices, and transformations. And somewhere in that wind, Marco liked to imagine he could hear his father's voice, not judging, not condemning, but simply acknowledging, "I see you, figlio mio. I see what you've become. I see what you're trying to do. And though the path wasn't what I would have chosen, I understand. I understand." It probably wasn't real. Probably just Marco's exhausted mind creating comfort where none existed. But standing in his Manhattan penthouse, holding that photograph, Marco Vitale, son, orphan, killer, king, and would-be savior, chose to believe it anyway. Because sometimes belief is all we have, and sometimes that's enough. Times